The Sega Dreamcast, also known as the original Xbox, we have at home. Or maybe the best, worst console of all time. Can you tell I don't think very highly of the Dreamcast? I didn't have a Dreamcast growing up. And statistically, you probably didn't either. I was growing up during the twilight of the Xbox, PS2, GameCube generation of video game consoles, and the whole time I had never even heard of the Dreamcast. Most of the kids that I knew had a GameCube or a PS2, and if you had a cool uncle, you had an Xbox. Later on, as I got more interested in video games, I would browse around on Wikipedia to learn more about the game consoles of the past, and eventually I landed on the Dreamcast. Finding this thing for the first time was like a fever dream. Like, wait a second, you're telling me that Sonic Adventure 2 wasn't just a GameCube game? Sega kept making game consoles after the Genesis? And who could even blame me for not knowing? The Dreamcast had completely come and gone in the time span that it took me to learn to stop shitting in a diaper. Yet Sega over here was just celebrating 20 years of Dreamcast. 20 years? It wasn't even on sale for 2! So that's where I come from. The Dreamcast has always just kind of been a footnote to me. Just a little side quest that you could go on when you want to get into retro gaming. I always figured that if I chose not to bother with the Dreamcast, I wouldn't be missing much. But at the same time, the way I enjoy things is a little different. I'm all about the hacking, modding, and homebrew stuff. And let me tell ya, I'm in pretty deep. And luckily for me, whether a console succeeded or failed commercially doesn't generally factor into what you can do with it homebrew-wise. On this channel, I've shown you guys what you can do with a lot of my favorite consoles. But the Dreamcast, it's uncharted territory for me. Does homebrew on this thing suck as much as the sales figures for it did? Maybe, but there's only one way to find out. One way to find out about the sponsor of today's video, Thorum! Thorum is owned by a couple from Tampa, Florida. They went outside, took a great big gander at everything they saw, and thought to themselves, I bet I could make a ring out of that. So they got to work acquiring stone, redwood, steel, tungsten, and titanium, and they made some of the finest and most unique rings that you can find today. But this is Thorum we're talking about. They didn't stop there. Whiskey barrel? Ring. Antler? Ring. Meteorite? Ring. Fossilized dinosaur bone? Ring. After making all these rings, Thorum took one look at everything they'd made, and then they thought to themselves, bet I could make a watch out of that too. And so they did. So far, they've created the Aloha watch, featuring heartwood and sapwood, the Meteorite watch, featuring, well, meteorite, and the Redwood watch, which I have right here, as well as the Redwood ring. The tungsten carbide on the ring and the stainless steel on the watch both feel incredibly nice to the touch. If you're looking for a high-quality watch or ring for both men and women, surf that browser of yours over to Thorum.com. All rings include a lifetime warranty, and by using code Bringus Studios during checkout, you'll get 20% off your whole order. So the Dreamcast, it loads its games exclusively through an optical drive, optical media bad, which in this case is a GD-ROM drive made by Yamaha. A GD-ROM drive is different from a CD-ROM drive because it uses GD media, which holds 1.2 gigabytes of data, compared to CDs, which only hold 700 megabytes of data. So like, way to go Sega, right? GD-ROMs were a 71% improvement over CDs. That's just amazing. Why didn't everybody else start using these? Oh yeah. Yeah, the PS2 and Xbox, and to some extent the GameCube, all avoided CD storage limitations by just using DVDs. With the way that games were getting bigger at the time, with higher quality graphics and textures, 1.2 gigabytes was not gonna cut it this generation. Hey, no sweat for Yamaha though. GD-ROM sucks? No big deal. We still got our drum kit, motorcycle, piano, guitar, jet ski, robotics, snowmobile, boat, semiconductor manufacturing equipment, and crop dusting RC helicopter businesses to keep us afloat. Funny enough, the best part about the drive that they threw in here has nothing to do with the GD-ROM format at all. No, this drive has the ability to read regular CDs for compatibility with mil-CD discs. What's mil-CD? Honestly, nobody really cares. All you really need to know is that it massively backfired, because it's why the Dreamcast can read games burned to CDs right out of the box. Well, most of them at least. If your Dreamcast has a 0 or a 1 right here, odds are that the very cool and very real games that are burned to CDs that you have will play just fine. And when it comes to burned games on CDs, the fact that CDs store less data than real Dreamcast discs does actually create some problems for some Dreamcast games. But for the most part, things still work fine and you don't even really notice. But enough about optical media. I don't even like optical media. How about the CPU? This guy is a 200 megahertz MIPS CPU made by Hitachi. And we all know what else Hitachi makes. Excavators. But what are we gonna be running on that beautiful 200 megahertz chip? Well, anything we want. But how? Normally, to try some Dreamcast homebrew out yourself, you'd have to burn a new CD for every application. Not only that, but even if you just wanted to add some ROMs to an emulator or something, bam, new CD. That sucks. Unlike consoles like the Wii, which have an SD card slot on the front and USB ports on the back, there's no real standard format of storage on the Dreamcast other than the optical drive. There is a cheap SD card adapter for the serial port, but I've heard it's very slow and the compatibility is hit and miss. All of this makes exploring the world of homebrew not only kind of a pain here, but just wasteful too. Not everybody has the skills to make CD art out of their old burns, so usually they're going right in the trash. If you just want to check out a few things, then I guess a 10-pack of CDs and a USB writer will do you just fine. But if you want to get into it, I'd recommend a GDEMU. I installed one in this Dreamcast, and if you want to see me flail around trying to figure that one out, I made a video about it a while ago that you can find on the channel. The GDEMU pretends to be a GD-ROM drive, but it reads everything from an SD card. It even lets you use this nice front end right here to load everything from. There's also some other wacky ways to install storage in this thing, like you can adapt a compact flash card or even a freaking IDE hard drive into it, and those methods are actually pretty cool because then you don't have to gut your optical drive. But for most people though, I still think that the GDEMU is the best way to go since it's pretty much plug and play once you get the thing open. There's no soldering. You just have to be willing to sacrifice your optical drive, and I know I am. Let's put that GDEMU to use and check out some ports, huh? The Dreamcast actually has a lot of games unofficially ported to it, including one of my favorites, Dota 2. Super Mario 64. While N64 emulation on the Dreamcast isn't much to write home about, and I'll talk more on that later, Super Mario 64 itself also is not great. Super Mario 64 on the Dreamcast is a port of the decompiled source code. Mario's extra large mustache returns from the awful Wii port that I covered last year. Love to see that consistency. Text boxes actually work properly on this one, unlike the Wii, although I do kind of miss the SpaghettiOs, I'm not gonna lie. The game usually runs at about 50% speed, which is obviously less than ideal. You can find moments of full speed gameplay scattered around, but it doesn't really happen often. But this is just one build. Many people have attempted to get it running on the Dreamcast, some with more success than others. For example, this other build has proper widescreen support, and for some reason it runs faster than it's supposed to, and the draw order is all screwed up. I don't know, it's kind of a mess. I'm glad that Mario 64 is working at all on the Dreamcast, since at this point in my life, I want to see this game run on absolutely everything before I eat shit and die. But as far as actually playing the game on here, don't waste your time. Another game I always love to check out in these kinds of videos is Half-Life, and on the Dreamcast, it's a bit of an oddity. This version is not a community-made homebrew port. In fact, it's as close to the real deal as you can get. Despite Half-Life never being released on the Dreamcast, it was fully ported by Captivation Digital Laboratories. Gearbox Software also made additional brand new content for it called Half-Life Blue Shift. Blue Shift was originally created for the Dreamcast specifically. A second disc was even planned for release after the first, which would have contained extra goodies like Opposing Forces multiplayer, Team Fortress Classic, and Counter-Strike. That would have been sick! The intention was obviously to release the game officially on the Dreamcast, but all of this unfortunately fell through after Sierra, the publisher for the game, canned the whole thing after the project was delayed several times. Eventually, a build of the game was leaked in 2003. It has a build date of May 23rd, 2001, about a month before the whole thing was canceled. So this leaked build serves well enough as an example of what the finished game would have been like, and it's what you're seeing me play here today. The Dreamcast and PC versions of Half-Life are actually fairly different from each other. If you want to learn more about that, I'd recommend watching Ratlobber's video covering Half-Life's ports. I don't really want to get into the weeds of that in this video. What I will get into though is how the game plays on the Dreamcast, which is poopy and bad. Look at this thing. How do you play a first-person shooter on it? Who f***ing knows? They opted to make the face buttons move you around, and the joystick moves the camera. As disgusting as this may seem in an era with modern shooters, it's probably still the best way to set the controls up. But it leaves you with just 6 buttons for everything else. Half-Life is not a 6-button game. To solve this, they made the left trigger a mode shift key that switches the functions of what all the buttons do. There are some other control schemes outside of the default one, and you are granted the freedom to set this atrocity up in any way that you can think of. But you know what? You could just choose not to use a controller at all. There's full Dreamcast keyboard and mouse support here. Also, yeah, those exist. I don't have the luxury of owning either of those though, so I suffer. But, I mean, it's only $70. Okay, so maybe I do own a Dreamcast keyboard, but that's all you're getting out of me. I'm not spending $100 on the mouse. But I do have to say, Half-Life on the Dreamcast with a keyboard is kinda great. Even without the mouse, it's so much better. I played the game with my right index finger on the joystick and my thumb on the D-pad. It's not super optimal, but with aim assist, it's not that bad. I highly, highly recommend the keyboard and mouse if you want to play FPS games. A solid number of them on the Dreamcast have full support for the peripherals. Just be prepared to spend good money for a ball mouse in 2024. As for how Half-Life runs, it's fine for the most part. It's not great, it's not terrible. It's exactly what you would expect from Half-Life running on a Dreamcast. The frame rate dips hard in some areas, and I experienced a good amount of stuttering while fighting the Black Ops assassins. There's no autosave at all, which sucks really bad. There isn't even quick save. This is all made even worse because saving the game requires you to go way out of the action. And it wouldn't be so bad if the game didn't take its sweet time to write saves to the VMU. So it kinda just sucks all around. Overall, I would say that Half-Life on the Dreamcast is probably the worst way to play Half-Life. But it's not unplayable. If I was a kid again and this is the only way I could play Half-Life, I could make do with it. And despite the way it might play, the mystique and the story behind its creation and subsequent leaking to the public is really cool. I'm glad we can play it here today. It would have been a shame if it was just lost forever. And like the PC version of Half-Life, the Dreamcast port also enjoyed a good amount of mods. The one I want to try the most is Counter-Strike, which presents itself with 2 other games in this web browser looking window or something. This is a custom pack made by some dude, so that's why it looks like this. It even has the signature weird music in the background. As is the custom for bootleg game packs. Once you get in game, you enter this custom hub world of some kind where you can enter into these rooms in order to load different maps. Once you load into the map, you're given a mission to carry out, then you have to go and kill all of the NPCs that are in your way. This is not like any Counter-Strike that I've ever played, but it's something, I guess. There's a whole lot more mods to try, but I think for now that's gonna wrap up our Half-Life adventure. There is one more port that I want to look at though. So I never played the original Postal. I've only ever played Postal 2. So my first time experiencing the game at all is right here, right now, on the Dreamcast. It feels less unique and a lot less comedic than the second game. As for the quality of the port, it runs extremely well, which makes sense because this was sold as an unlicensed retail release way after the Dreamcast was discontinued. We'll talk more about those kind of games later, because there's a lot of them. But Postal here is a great port, and I'm sure a lot of people are happy to see it. Aside from game ports, what else is out there for Dreamcast homebrew that's not an emulator? Like the Xbox, for example, had XBMC, but the Dreamcast? It's not really as useful for something like a media center in the way that the Xbox is, but there are still a few cool things to do. Like nearly every other game console these days, the Dreamcast has its own homebrew port of Linux. I snagged a version of Red Hat to try, and it booted up just fine. I typed my login with my fancy new keyboard, and then I remembered that I didn't buy a mouse. Yeah, not much I can do from here. But there is a copy of Doom built into it, and oh no, that's terrible, never mind. Along the same lines as Linux was an operating system called NetBSD. I got the kernel booted up, but doing anything beyond that seemed like a challenge that I'm not really up for, considering you need to get the Dreamcast hooked up to your local network, and then run some NFS shares for the Dreamcast to pull stuff off of, and no, not today. Remember how the Dreamcast has this little guy in the controllers, the VMU? Well, there's even homebrew for these things too. There's a utility called VMU Tool that lets you do all kinds of exciting stuff to your VMU, like defragment its disk. How exciting. You can dump your save files, change the image that's displayed on the VMU screen. You can even hex edit the storage on it directly. It's a really powerful tool. You can transfer minigames to the VMU without owning a copy of the game that minigame came with, which is cool. There's even a couple of homebrew games to play. There was a tiny version of Pokemon being worked on for the VMU, but sadly it looks like the project was abandoned. Alright, I know what you guys have been waiting for. What is a homebrew video without emulation? But before I talk about the capability of the Dreamcast as an emulation device, I want to tell you about an interesting footnote in Dreamcast history regarding a semi-official Genesis emulator. So back in the day, there was a game cracking group for the Dreamcast called Echelon. They would post ripped copies of tons of Dreamcast games illegally. There was also a game called the Sega Smash Pack. It was an official collection of older Genesis games that ran on an emulator created by Sega. The emulator itself was pretty crap. But what makes it interesting is that when you rip the game disc and browse the contents of it, you'll find a file on the root of the disc called echelon.txt. Turns out, this file was indeed referencing the cracking group Echelon. The file itself contains documentation on the emulator that was developed for the pack. There's instructions on how to boot your own Genesis ROMs. The developer that wrote it signed off on the end with, "Don't forget to pay your respects to Uncle Sonic." Sony just doesn't get it. I imagine this was in reference to the fact that Sega was going under as a console maker at the time, since that was announced to the public on the same day that this pack was released. Man, imagine being this developer, knowing that the Dreamcast was getting canned, and yet still having to work on this collection for it. And not only that, imagine being told to slap a Volume 1 on the front of the game, as if there was even a chance of a Volume 2. I guess the note that the dev left was pretty much him saying, "Oh, you want a Volume 2? Okay, sure, make it yourself, idiot. Here's the emulator. Good luck." Back in the Dreamcast homebrew world, a whole load of emulators have been created for it. This thing is a great way to experience older consoles like the Atari 2600, the Intellivision, the ColecoVision, all that weird old stuff. You know what? I don't really care. Let's just move on to the NES. And NES on the Dreamcast is exactly what it sounds like. I'm playing Mega Man 2 with a Dreamcast controller. Very cool. This is running on the Nestor DC SE emulator, and there's really nothing to note here except that NES works, and it works perfectly. Sega Master System games work just as well as NES ones, but this time you get a cool little picture on the VMU. This is the first time I've actually ever played a Master System game, so I don't really know if things are completely running correctly, but as far as I can tell they are. These transitions in Sonic Spinball look just fantastic, but I think that's how they're supposed to look. Spider-Man vs. the Kingpin ran well, even if I couldn't figure out what the heck I was supposed to be doing other than giving the cops a taste of their own medicine. Then I got my ass handed to me in some tennis game. Look at this, I practically handed the win to this asshole. But Master System on the Dreamcast works great. A console I am far more familiar with, though, is the Sega Genesis. The emulator Gens for Dreams brought me great joy as I played through some of the most renowned Genesis classics ever. Animaniacs, Bubsy, and Chester Cheetah. And you know what? The Dreamcast did fantastic while playing these games. Just like the other emulators, I have nothing bad to say about it. Super Nintendo, however, is where I imagined this thing was going to start to struggle a bit, and oh yeah, it did. Think of any hallmark of poor emulation and trust me, you'll find it here. Missing layers? We got those. Crusty audio? You betcha. Sub 100% speed? No problem. Nauseating frame skipping? Coming right up. But yeah, SNES emulation is not great. Also, 2024 is the year of SNES. SNES is canceled. This gameplay was in the emulator SNES for All, but that's not the only one I tried. I also downloaded Dream SNES, which was better sometimes, but also worse sometimes. In Dream SNES, I felt like there were more slowdowns and frame skipping, but generally it worked better and seemed more accurate. You can see in Pac-Man 2 in SNES for All, the black circle that surrounds the scene here is super low resolution and blocky, but in Dream SNES, it looks correct. Dream SNES actually booted Mrs. Pac-Man too, unlike SNES for All, which didn't. With all of that, plus the crappy D-pad on this thing anyway, SNES on the Dreamcast is just kind of more of a novelty. I wouldn't seriously try and play anything on here. GBA emulation, no, I'm just kidding. GBA emulation is a complete mess. This is the GPSP-DC emulator, and from what I can tell, it's the only GBA emulator on here worth giving a damn about. But despite that, no amount of frame skipping or marketing from LEGO could save Galador here. It just sucks. Then I tried Breakout Centipede Warlords because I thought, hey, those are some basic old games. They'll probably run fine. But the ROM didn't even boot, so nope, never mind. Codename Kids Next Door was about as crap as Galador. And with that, my official diagnosis for GBA on the Dreamcast is don't. There was apparently a Nintendo 64 emulator at one point that could boot games, but it couldn't do much more than that. This video from 16 years ago, published by Simpson474, shows it booting Mario 64 and then running really slow. But, I mean, It is running. I can't show it off myself because all the links to it are dead, but based on this footage, it doesn't look like we're missing out on much. PlayStation 1 is a very, very interesting topic on the Dreamcast. There's an emulator that used to be available for purchase called Dreamcast. If that sounds familiar to you, it should, because it was derived from the famous Bleem PS1 emulator for PC. If you don't already know about Bleem, check out both LGR and Gaming Historian's videos. The story surrounding that emulator is really fascinating. Dreamcast boot discs were available for purchase. You'd buy the disc, put it in your Dreamcast, and then swap it out for the PS1 game that matched the boot disc you were using. It was really that simple. Just like that, you could play PS1 games on the Dreamcast. The games themselves even looked and ran better on the Dreamcast than they did on the PS1. I know we kind of expect that for emulators running on PCs nowadays, but this was 1999. That's just crazy. Think about it. This console is struggling to play GBA games here, but PlayStation 1 runs full speed at double the resolution and with video enhancements? Bleem is just magic. But back on track here, Dreamcast only officially had compatibility with 3 games. People were able to exploit a leaked beta version of the Dreamcast emulator to create their own boot discs that worked with other PS1 games. These homebrew versions are referred to as Bleemed games, and I've got 3 to show you right here. The first is Crash Bandicoot, and apart from the audio losing everything except the background music, it's playing like it was just made for the Dreamcast. There are some visual bugs, but for what it is and at the level of performance it's running at, this is nothing short of amazing. Even everybody's favorite Pepsi game is running great, apart from the cutscene at the beginning being entirely destroyed, and some texture glitching here and there, Pepsi Man is completely playable. Parappa the Rapper is not great. The cutscenes are all completely missing, the audio is very chunky, and the animations are all too fast. It's kind of funny to watch because the animations complete too early, so they all kind of just freeze in place until they're supposed to start the next animation. But despite these issues, it does run, and there's 0 slowdowns. And these were just a few games. There's tons of Bleemed games out there. There are some community compatibility lists that document how well certain games work, but they're very incomplete. So your mileage will definitely vary if you try this yourself. But either way, for what this is, I know I already said it earlier, but Bleem and Dreamcast are just magic. And apart from porting games and running emulators on the Dreamcast, there's also a humongous library of completely original homebrew games. And these ones on the Dreamcast, they are world class. The titles you'll find on the Dreamcast are the gold standard for community-made games on any console as far as I'm concerned. However, the lines do kind of blur a bit when it comes to classifying them as homebrew, since a lot of these games are commercial products. And to some people, that's not homebrew. The way I see it, anyone circumventing Sega to get their games on the Dreamcast is making homebrew, whether they're charging for it or not. In fact, if charging for their games means they can keep making more stuff, by all means, I'm all for it. A lot of these games are sold through real publishers, which is pretty cool. It's a concept that I've never really seen before outside of a few new titles for the NES or Game Boy that pop up from time to time. Thanks to the fact that almost any Dreamcast can just run unlicensed games, indie developers can sell their games to anybody that wants to play them, regardless of if their console's been modified or not. Because of this, these developers can reach a fairly sizable audience, and you'll find a level of polish on Dreamcast homebrew games that you just don't see anywhere else. One example of these games is Intrepid Izzy. It's a Metroidvania-style platformer that came out in 2017 by Senile Team. This is just a normal game that came out on Steam, the Nintendo eShop, the Xbox Series consoles, PS4, PS5, and for some reason, the Dreamcast. Why? I don't know. Why not, I guess? I mean, the Dreamcast port runs fantastic. The whole thing looks and feels great to play. I don't know what it took for them to port this game. All I know is that they did it really well, and I'm glad it's here. But you know, do you ever just look at Rocket League and long for a Dreamcast version? Best I can offer is Driving Strikers. It's Rocket League, but very stripped down, and from a completely different camera angle. It plays well enough. I mean, it's a bit janky, but it's not too bad. The part of this game that's really cool though is that the developers also released it on Steam with cross-play to the Dreamcast version. In case you're not sure what that means, it means that in 2024, there is a Dreamcast game being sold today, unofficially, that can connect to and play multiplayer with a Steam game. It's so cursed. I love it. But what else does the Dreamcast have? Xenocider is a third-person rail shooter that looks great. They channeled the Dreamcast era graphics perfectly with this thing. This game is also available on modern platforms, but it hasn't been fully released yet. You can only play the demo. What they've got so far though looks great, and it plays well, and it's also completely unforgiving. I got through the tutorial, got my ass handed to me in level 1 3 times, and then got a game over. Fun game, but fairly difficult. If that's your thing and you're into the late 90s, early 2000s style, then try it out. Sturmwind is a German game by Duranick that actually came out on Dreamcast first in 2013. The version on other platforms came out later in 2019. It's a 2D rail shooter that also recreates the aesthetics of these early 2000s, late 90s games pretty nicely. It's very polished and it plays well, so it definitely makes the list. This is Tunnels. It's Half-Life, but with a giant spider. Oh, wait, hold on. At one point, I paused the game and the whole thing crashed, so that was cool. This guy doesn't even want to fight me. What the heck? As far as I can tell, you're just supposed to walk into one of these tunnels, which eventually leads you back to the main chamber, and then at some point, you gotta kill the spider by just smacking it a bunch. Then you get a screen saying you survived, and then the map reloads. It's obviously more of a tech demo than anything, but I wanted to include it because I thought it just looks cool, and it seems like it would serve as a really nice base if somebody wanted to build an FPS off of it. So, how do I feel about the Dreamcast homebrew scene now that I've experienced what it has to offer? I don't think it's the best, but I also don't think it's the worst. What I do think is that they've got something special. I was hesitant to make this video at first because I assumed that nobody was going to bother doing anything with a failed console with a terrible controller and a crippled storage format. But boy was I wrong. The Dreamcast community has really made the console their own, no doubt about that. And with indie developers choosing to make brand new games for the Dreamcast, they have truly given it a second lease on life. You know, I've had this image of a lost dog in my head while I've been making this video. One where the dog's original owner left them behind because they didn't live up to the owner's expectations. But after finding the right person, the dog was taken in with open arms, and it grew and it thrived. That's the story of the Dreamcast. The Dreamcast lives on today as something greater than it ever used to be. You know, at least to me as someone who never really understood its appeal. It turns out that all it needed was some patience and love from the people that really cared about it. The Dreamcast is old, but it's been taught some new tricks. I'm glad I got to experience them myself. I think I'm finally starting to get it. The Dreamcast was not a successful console. It looked dated even for the time, and the average gamer probably thinks of it as nothing more than the thing that killed Sega home consoles for good, if they even remember it at all. But there is no doubt in my mind that after everything it's been through, and after both Sega and the general public moved on, the Dreamcast didn't just fade away. It found its place and its people, and in that place, and by those people, it's loved just the way it is. Long live the Dreamcast. Nah, I'm just kidding. I still fucking hate this thing. I hate it so much that I'm giving it to you! Want this Dreamcast? It's yours, my friend, as long as you enter the giveaway. You get this Dreamcast, which is the one that's modded with the GDEMU. You get the SD card, which I'm not erasing, by the way. So everything you saw in the video is pretty much on here. You get a controller that's just as yellow as the console, a VMU with a fresh set of batteries, plus a power and a video cable to actually use it. And how do you enter this mighty fine giveaway of mine? Number 1, like the video. Number 2, subscribe. Number 3, leave a comment. Number 4, have a Discord account. When I draw the winner, I'm going to find the winner's comment on the video, and I'm going to reply to it. And to claim the prize, you then have to reply to me in your comment with your Discord username. So then I can find you on Discord, and we can hash out all the details like the address and all that. This giveaway is open to those in the main 48 states in the US and Canada. I have no confidence in the American postal system to get this thing overseas, so sorry everyone else. But yeah, that's all you gotta do. Check out all these cool social accounts that I made. It's the best way to keep up with whatever the heck it is I'm doing nowadays. And yeah, gaming.